August 7th, 2025. The United States Treasury auctioned $25 billion of 30-year bonds. The bid-to-cover ratio, the measure of how much demand exists for every dollar of debt on offer, came in at 2.27. Reuters described it as the weakest in nearly 2 years. Yields rose immediately. The market had absorbed the debt, but it had demanded a higher price to do it. That single auction was a data point. What sits behind it is a structural problem that no G7 government has publicly explained, and it involves every taxpayer in this room. For most of the period between 2009 and 2021, advanced economy governments borrowed in conditions that will not be seen again for a generation. Interest rates were near zero. Central banks across OECD countries accumulated a peak of $15 trillion in government bonds, absorbing supply and compressing the cost of long-term borrowing to levels that made fiscal expansion feel close to free. Governments ran larger deficits, issued more debt, and, critically, issued much of it at short maturities because short-term rates were cheaper. Then came 2022. Inflation ran at the fastest pace in 40 years. Every major central bank raised rates. The same institutions that had been buying bonds began, systematically, to sell them. The OECD's Global Debt Report 2025 documents that central bank holdings of sovereign bonds fell from that $15 trillion peak in 2021 to just above $12 trillion by 2024. With a further $1 trillion projected to leave in 2025. That is $4 trillion of additional supply that the private market has to absorb, at precisely the moment governments need to borrow more. And here is the part that is not in the headlines. The OECD's Global Debt Report 2025 puts a precise figure on what is coming. Nearly 45% of all sovereign debt in OECD countries will mature by 2027. Almost all of it will be refinanced at rates dramatically higher than the coupons on the bonds it replaces. The mechanism by which this plays out, and which governments it hits hardest, is what most coverage has failed to make clear. Start with the scale. The IMF's Fiscal Monitor from October 2024 confirmed that global public debt crossed $100 trillion for the first time in 2024. $100 trillion. A number that becomes visceral only when you calculate what servicing it costs when rates are near 4%, not 0.5. In the United States, the answer is now a matter of public record. The Congressional Budget Office's monthly budget review for fiscal year 2025 confirms that net interest payments on the federal debt surpassed $1 trillion for the first time. $1 trillion spent not on infrastructure, not on healthcare, not on defense, but simply on the interest bill for money already borrowed. In fiscal year 2024, for the first time, net interest surpassed U.S. defense spending. The countries most exposed to what happens next are named explicitly in the OECD's Global Debt Report 2025. 4 countries, France, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States, face what the report calls heightened vulnerability. In each case, the debt maturing by 2027 exceeds 15% of current GDP, and the average yield on new debt issued in 2024 surpasses the yield on that maturing debt by more than 1.5 percentage points. For these 4 countries, the OECD estimates that refinancing this debt will increase annual interest payments by roughly 0.4 percentage points of GDP by 2027. But the interest cost is only half the problem. The other half is about who is being asked to buy this debt and what has changed about their willingness to do so.
For 2 decades, sovereign bond markets had what economists call a structural bid.
a reliable, price-insensitive buyer base that absorbed new issuance without demanding significantly higher yields. It rested on three pillars. Pension funds under defined benefit rules were required to hold long-dated government bonds. Central banks were accumulating them. Foreign governments were parking reserves in them, particularly in U.S. Treasuries. All three pillars have weakened simultaneously. The OECD's Global Debt Report 2025 documents that central bank holdings fell from 29% of total OECD sovereign debt outstanding in 2021 to 19% by 2024. The buyers who replaced them, domestic households, hedge funds, and price-sensitive foreign investors, now hold a growing share. Unlike central banks or pension funds under regulatory mandates, these investors are responsive to price. When they feel they are not being compensated adequately for holding long-duration debt, they demand higher yields. That is a term premium, the extra return required for locking in money over decades rather than days. It had been compressed to near zero. It is not near zero now. This is the dynamic the OECD's Global Debt Report 2026 crystallizes in a single figure. 78% of OECD government borrowings in 2026 will be used not to fund new investment or public services, but solely to refinance existing debt. Governments are not building their way out of this. They are rolling it. The question every investor and every taxpayer should now be asking, and that very few commentators have stated plainly, is whether this refinancing cycle resolves through growth, through financial repression, or through something more disruptive. Here is what this story is actually about, and it is bigger than interest rates or fiscal deficits. Advanced economies built their debt frameworks during an era when sovereign borrowing was structurally subsidized by three simultaneous forces: central bank quantitative easing, pension regulation that mandated long-duration bond holding, and foreign governments that parked reserves in Western sovereign debt as a matter of policy. All three of those forces are now in retreat at the same time. The OECD's analysis makes this structural shift explicit. The buyer base is now more price-sensitive, more volatile, and more dependent on term premiums that governments cannot control. The consequence, for France, Spain, the UK, and the US specifically, is that refinancing 15% or more of GDP in debt before 2027 will cost more than projected, and the fiscal space available for everything else will compress accordingly. Where experts genuinely disagree is on what comes next. Some argue governments will quietly tolerate above-target inflation as a slow-motion debt relief mechanism. Others argue that only credible fiscal consolidation can restore the term premium to manageable levels. The data does not resolve that question. It makes it urgent. A government that spends more managing its past than investing in its future is not governing. It is servicing. The structural buyer of sovereign debt has not disappeared. It has become price-sensitive, and that changes everything about what governments can afford to promise. The question I want your take on: some economists argue that G7 governments will resolve this debt overhang through inflation, accepting above-target price growth as the practical exit strategy and quietly eroding the real value of what they owe. Others argue that only genuine fiscal consolidation works, and that trying to inflate out of it destroys the creditor relationships governments need to keep borrowing at scale. Which path do you think actually plays out? And can any government afford to be honest about which one they are choosing? Leave your take in the comments. If you want to understand how global financial systems actually work, not the version in the press release, but the mechanism, subscribe. That is what this channel is for. The previous video on this channel, The dollar weapon is backfiring on its own allies. Examined how using the dollar as a geopolitical instrument is pushing allies and adversaries toward adversaries, eroding the structural demand for dollar-denominated assets. This video shows the other side of the same dynamic. At the precise moment the United States needs to refinance the largest share of its debt in decades, the foreign central banks and governments that once absorbed that debt as a matter of policy are stepping back. Watching both gives you a complete picture of what happens when the world's reserve currency issuer begins to lose its structural advantage in its own bond market. It is on the screen right now.